Team up with people who are role models in marriage. Join them for dinner. Visit them. See how they talk with one another. Listen to their conversation. Be a keen student of how marriage works. You see what I'm saying? You don't study wealth by studying poverty. Does that make sense? You don't become healthy by studying how people are sick. To fight for your marriage, number 2, keep your marriage off intruders. Keep your marriage off intruders. The first people who are going to test this principle are your own children, followed by close relatives, then close friends in that order. Let me make it crystal clear. Children are not part of your marriage. They are part of your family. No child should compete with your spouse. Don't subject your spouse to competition with anyone or anything except God. That's rule: forsaking all others. Don't allow your wife compete with your mother-in-law. Don't allow your husband compete with your mother-in-law, father-in-law, brothers or sisters. Design your hedges clearly. Marital hedges must be mutually agreed, consistent, and predictable. Marcy and I had the benefit of agreeing on these hedges before we got married, and I'll give you an example. We agreed before we got married, any single assistance to her home has to be through me. Any single assistance to my home has to go through her. So if my mom needs money, Mercy says her. If her mother needs money, I said her. This way, we have sent a strong signal for 14 years that we are one. And you need to make it so clear that you left to cleave. You are no longer mama's boy. You are no longer mama's girl. You are a mature person running your own family. And the symbol of maturity is your ability to build hedges around your family. Number 3, and the last point, to fight for your family, pray as a couple. Fight for your family in prayers. Let me tell you this. While I believe in teaching, training, coaching, and mentorship, there is no amount of motivation, training, coaching, and mentorship that will ever replace the role of God in marriage. In any war, your first role is to identify the real enemy. Your enemy is not your husband. Your enemy is not your wife. Your enemy is not your mother-in-law. Your enemy is the devil. There is not a single marriage that can survive but by the grace of God. Each one of you seated in this hall, and those who will ever listen to this recording, you have had affairs. I'm telling you, the person seated next to you is a hypocrite. Each one of you. You see, God's standards are not our standards. When I started describing, I talked of 2 levels, physical and emotional. But God goes beyond that. Jesus said, whoever looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery. In other words, from God's standard, it's mental affair. If you have ever fantasized about anyone, even if you never told them, even if you never text, you have had an affair. Let me ask today, who has never had an affair? Who? Where? There's one there. I think there's a language communication barrier. All of us are victims of affairs. And I'll explain to you. I'll pull a story. They caught a woman having an affair. They had concrete evidence. They cited their law. According to our law, she ought to die. One thing that surprises me, she knew she would be killed. Her predecessors had been stoned to death, but she still did it. That tells you sin is stronger than death. That's why people die of HIV/AIDS. They are aware about the disease, but sin is stronger than death. And when they brought her to Jesus, the prosecutors and the judges were one item on the same side. In their law, there was no appeal. She was not given a chance for public defense. She was counting minutes before her death. Jesus, we caught her having affairs. It's interesting to remind you, they never brought the man. They only brought the woman. I don't know why the society always castigates the woman after an affair. Then Jesus looked at them and said, whoever among you has never had an affair, pick up the first stone. I'm paraphrasing. Pick up the first stone. One by one, they left. Did Jesus break the law? Isn't he the same one who told Moses they should be stoned to death? I believe what transpired that day, for the law of God to be satisfied, Jesus was on his way to the cross to pay for her sin, to die for her crime. So he looked at her and said, go and sin no more. That's my message for you. Grace makes you strong at your weakest point. Grace gives you strength at your weakest, most vulnerable point. The grace of God. Had it not been for the grace of God, some of you could not have completed school because of fees. Had it not been for the grace of God, some of the marriages presented here tonight would have crashed long ago. But the grace. Some of you today, your bodies will be buried in the graveyard and your souls languishing in hell. But the grace. And there's provision of that grace in our midst tonight. That grace that saved a saint like you and a wretch like me. In 1748, a notorious slave dealer was about to drown off the coast of Ireland and face an eternal reality in hell when he cried unto God. And God came through for John Newton. He broke in streams of tears and sang the most amazing hymn in human history, Amazing Grace. How sweet those sounds. Grace is what makes you to forgive your spouse when they have had an affair. Grace is what makes you recognize that we all live in glass houses. We can't afford to pick a stone and throw to the next house. Grace is what makes you give another person a second opportunity because you recognize you are a product of his grace. When your accusers condemned you, grace nullified their accusations. They had evidence against you. Grace canceled the accusations. Amazing grace. There is a story I like sharing about a man who fell in a pit, helpless, stranded. In a moment, a realist was passing by, looked at the guy in a deep pit, and said, goodness, I'm so sorry. He fell in a pit. A couple of minutes, an objective person passed by and said, it's logical to fall in such a deep pit. Moments later, a subjective person passed by, looked at the guy in the pit and said, I feel for you down there in the pit. Minutes later, a pessimist passed by and told the guy in the pit, things could have been worse. A pessimist passed by, looked at him eyeball to eyeball and told him, things will get worse. A self-pitying person passed by, looked at the guy in the pit and said, you have seen nothing yet until you see my pit. An evasive person passed by, looked at him and avoided the subject of the pit altogether. Then a Pharisee passed by, looked at him and said, only sinners fall in the pit. A fundamentalist passed by and said, you deserve your pit. An evangelical preacher passed by, looked at him and said, had you been a Christian, you wouldn't have fallen in the pit. A Pentecostal person passed by, saw the guy in the pit and told him, confess you're not in the pit. Then a motivational speaker passed by, looked at the guy in the pit and told him, be positive about your pit. Then the city engineer passed by and demanded to see the permit for digging the pit. Then the tax collector passed by and wanted to know whether the guy had paid taxes for living in the pit. Then a news reporter passed by and he wanted an exclusive coverage of how the guy ended up in the pit. Finally, Jesus passed by. He didn't care what took the man into the pit. With outstretched hands, he stooped down and lifted the man out of the pit.